When I got my diagnosis of PH, I actually just felt relieved, mainly because people believed me. I was told I had PH 10 years ago, and it took 8 years to get a diagnosis. I was a healthy child, I was a healthy teenager, I was a healthy young adult, I was sporty, I was into the great outdoors, I did all my sports clubs, I did loads of walking with Duke and Edinburgh as a teenager, and then something happened around the time of me graduating from university, so in my early 20s, I suddenly found that things that were easy before were no longer easy. Activities that I could previously do, I was struggling with.
We knew that something was wrong. It felt like Sarah wasn't able to do the things that it felt like she should be able to do. So she was, in general, an active person, but then we'd go on walks and she wouldn't quite be able to keep up for some reason. And it wasn't that it didn't feel like she was unfit. It wasn't that she wasn't trying, but it just felt something was holding her back, and it felt a strange time.
So when I started going to the GP to report these symptoms, I was basically told that I was unfit and anxious, and that basically carried on for the next 8 years. I saw lots of different doctors in that time. They just basically didn't believe me. They just thought I was a young girl in my 20s. I was probably getting a little bit paranoid about my health. I was probably getting a little bit worried that I was no longer as fit as I was, and I was probably a bit lazy. I think that's the sort of thing that was going through their head. And in fact, I've seen my GP notes since, and that's exactly what was going through their head.
It was frustrating watching almost from the outside, but alongside as she was trying to speak to the doctors to understand what had gone wrong, because she clearly knew something wasn't right, and without any medical experience or medical background, it's hard to know what to do for the best.
And so they just diagnosed me with chronic fatigue syndrome, because that basically is an illness that showed some of my symptoms, but you can't test for it. So because they couldn't work out what it was, they diagnosed me with that. And that carried on the frustration that I'd had for the last 8 years, because I was like, I think there's something more to it than this. And then eventually one day I went back to hospital, and they did I met a doctor that was doing some tests for me. I think I was doing a bubble echo test or something. And he had heard of PH, and then he was the starting pin that started it all, the whole diagnosis. And then I went to a PH centre, I got diagnosed properly. But that was pure luck that one of the technician people that was testing me when he was doing this echo bubble actually had heard of PH and thought, your results might be to do with that. I was right, there was something wrong with me. And yeah, it was just a complete relief. I mean, all those other emotions came later, but for a large part, for a long time, I was just happy that I had a name for what was wrong with me, that I was no longer ashamed of my illness because I was no longer worrying that people didn't believe me. In the last 15 years, the time to get a diagnosis has apparently not changed, which I think is awful.
The fact that treatments have improved dramatically over the last decade or more is fantastic, and it really does empower people and enable people to live much happier, more productive and longer lives, and that's all fantastic. But you can only get treated if you're diagnosed, and so getting that step to diagnosis is crucially important.
It was a big battle. I think the thing I want to get across is how much of a big internal battle it was, trusting the GPs and wanting to trust the GPs, because I'd been brought up to trust the GPs, you know, they know everything. And so if they're telling me there's nothing wrong, I wanted to believe them, and I wanted to believe them anyway, because nobody wants to be ill. But then this other part of me, like this gut inside me saying, no, there is something wrong with you. And it was a constant internal battle between those two. Some days I'd believe the GP, some days I'd believe myself. And I think that was one of the hardest parts of the journey to get my diagnosis, was that constant internal battle.